All right, I have the honor today to introduce you to Mitzi Pope and Shira Phelps. They are with the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, as you see. I have to just share with you that it's been a long in coming and too long that we have not had a program like we're having today. If you start thinking about some people call, I don't, this is just occurring to me, but some people call slavery our nation's original sin. And I think when that is said, it really neglects the truth, because the people who were here, Native and Indigenous people, and what has happened historically is really our nation's original sin. I've started to learn more about Native people in Florida. Some of us, I didn't know this, that the Seminole Nation of Florida has 6 reservations. The Muscogee tribe has also a reservation in Collier County at the end of Alligator Alley. And I started to become educated because it's been a huge gap in my own understanding and learning, and really being able to capture the responsibility that we all have to do a better job. So with that, I asked our presenters today to, they want to introduce themselves more. I'll just tell you, Mitzi is Yuchi, an enrolled member of the Muscogee Nation. And Shira, it's so great to be with you. We did another program with another project a while back, and I'm so grateful to have met you and to be doing work with you again. So let me turn it over to our presenters now, and they can start sharing the screen and just say, thank you so much for joining us today. And we are looking forward to your program. I'll say from a practical standpoint too, we will be getting your questions in the Q&A. We'll be looking at the chat as well. I'll be doing that. If you have questions, the presenters are open to hearing those questions and comments during their time. At the same time, if you want to hold your questions to the end, we'll also be having a little time at the end for that. So that's our process today, everybody. Welcome again. And Mitzi and Shira, it's all yours.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you so much for having us. And thank you all for joining us today. Mitzi and I will talk a little bit more about who we are and who the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center is. But I just wanted to echo what Robin said. Please feel free to ask questions anytime. We have a lot to talk about, but we also, would like as much interaction as we can in these virtual times. So please feel free to ask any question anytime, and we will try to get to it as soon as possible. And I think that's it. Oh, we're also going to be using something called Mentimeter that we're going to talk a little bit about. And here it is. We have our wonderful Cami Stevens behind the scenes from the center helping us with all of the tech stuff. Because believe me, you wouldn't want Mitzi and I in charge of the tech stuff. So Cami put in the chat to please go to mentimeter.com, either on your smartphone or on your computer, and put in the code that's at the top of the screen and let us know what word describes your current mood. This is just a practice run. I see some, there we go, happy. So for those who are, thank you for everyone who is putting their current mood into Mentimeter. It's a good thing to practice. It's a great tool, and we like to use it a lot. So this is just sort of a way to practice using it. We'll be using it a couple times during our presentation. For those who are feeling stressed and overwhelmed, I hope you are able to have a restful weekend and restorative weekend. I'm also feeling hopeful today. I just saw that one. So, Mitzi, how are you feeling today? What's your current mood?
I am also feeling hopeful and calm and excited about the weekend. It's Friday.
It sure is. All right, this looks great. Thank you all so much for sharing with us and letting us know how you're doing. We'll have more opportunities to try out the Mentimeter in a little while. Should we introduce ourselves first, Mitzi?
Yeah, sure.
Go
I'll
ahead.
go first.
Okay.
So my name is Mitzi Pope, and I am, like Robin said, I'm Yuchi. I'm a member of the Muscogee Nation here in Oklahoma, and I live in Oklahoma. I'm about 9 miles north of our tribal headquarters, and I am also a licensed clinical social worker. I've been with the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center since September of 2022. And prior to that, I worked for 12 years for the Muscogee Creek Nations, recently renamed Center for Victim Services. And I worked the last 5 years really primarily providing counseling to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And then prior to that, I did some time providing advocacy, sexual assault advocacy specifically, and then also doing some prevention work in our rural tribal communities. And I also started my working in our state-funded domestic violence shelter as a shelter advocate, which is, I always like to mention, was my most meaningful and impactful work. I was the 4 to midnight advocate, and so at the shelter, and really that was the start of my work in victim services. And so really happy to be here today and be able to present some information that will hopefully help you in your work.
Thanks, Mitzi.
You're welcome.
So I'm Shira Phelps, and I am joining you from Madison, Wisconsin, where it is very cold and snowy. I am jealous of all of you who are in Florida and hoping that you're having warmer weather. I have been with the center, and we'll tell you a little bit more about the center in a minute, for a little over a year, but have been in the anti-human trafficking and anti-gender-based violence work for over 20 years. I come from a direct victim services background for about 11 years, and then have approached trafficking from policy angles, with my law degree, with all sorts of different ways to address and respond to human trafficking. And I'm really excited to be here and to share some information with all of you today. So just a quick glance at our agenda. We can check off introductions. We have done them. We will talk to you a little bit about what the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center is, who we are, what we do. We're going to talk about human trafficking in Indian country, and then spend some time talking about building partnerships. And then we'll close out. And as we mentioned before, please feel free to ask questions at any time, and we will answer them. Yeah. And it's time for Mentimeter again. If you could please share with us, what lens do you bring to this work? So that could be victim services, law enforcement, survivor, whatever you're comfortable. If you want to include more than just one lens, please do. Since we can't see you and are not from Florida, we don't necessarily know what all of the organizations that you bring to the table. So please share with us what you're comfortable. case managers have some of the hardest jobs out there. So thank you for your work. Looks like a lot of people doing some really good advocate and direct victim services work. Law enforcement, medical system, child welfare.
Yeah, a really diverse group.
Wonderful. Thank you. I like problem solver. I feel like we should all wear t-shirts that just says problem solver, or capes. Maybe we need capes. All right. Thank you all. Should we move forward?
All right. So, as I mentioned, I am a licensed clinical social worker, and before coming to the center, I was providing counseling via telehealth to survivors. And I really had to pick up over the years some different ways to take care of myself, but also offer survivors ways to take care of themselves while we were talking about difficult things. So I'm sharing this with you, things that I've learned that really can just be helpful for us today. And as we're talking about human trafficking, as we're talking about a variety of different difficult topics today, I do want to encourage everyone to just take good care of yourself by doing any of the following, or your own self-care that you have, the practice that works for you. I know, like, my go-to is to take a drink of water. When in doubt, like, gulp water. So I do that a lot. I also adjust my posture a lot. I'll stretch. I won't do that as much on this call because it'd probably be disruptive, but please feel free to do so. I'm also like tapping my feet back and forth like right now. And I always have a rock in my hand, kind of telling myself, because this is really what helps to ground me. So when I'm talking about difficult things, or people are talking about difficult things, it really can sometimes bring up different feelings in our bodies. So I just encourage everybody, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to take a break, please feel free to do so. As we're going through this, I just encourage everybody to take care of yourself, but also feel free to use these tips when you're working with survivors and encouraging them to do that as well. Sometimes when we're in the moment, we really need like those basic present focus self-care things to take care of ourselves. And I think sometimes we can think of self-care as like getting a massage or like going for a walk, but we really need those in the moment things when we're working with survivors. So this is just something for you all to practice if you aren't already, and encourage you to do so as we do our presentation today.
And I'll say now, I always have a rock too that Mitzi gave me. And so I think of all of those self-care tips whenever I'm holding on to my rock. Thank you, Mitzi.
You're welcome.
So the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, the way that I like to think about us is we are a team of people across the country that are focused on working with tribes and native serving organizations to support their response to human trafficking. And that can look like a lot of different things. We focus on human trafficking education, as we are doing today, strength and healing and supportive services for survivors of trafficking, and help to identify resources. So those are very sort of broad things, and it's broad intentionally because we are able to be very creative in the way that we work with organizations and tribes in responding to human trafficking. Next slide, please. So some examples of sort of the wide variety of resources that we offer, and all of these you can find on our website, which is there, and we also will share our website again at the end, and we'll also be sending these slides to Robin, so they will be up on the website for all of you to have access to whenever you need them. We have talking circles. We have one coming up next week, in fact, so you can go to our website and find more information on that. Talking circles are you know, an opportunity to sort of listen to a panel of experts talking about a specific topic related to human trafficking, ask questions, listen, and participate in that way. We have a podcast called Reawakening the Spirit that you can also find on our website. We have monthly, more intimate virtual gatherings that we call Community of Care, which again focus on a particular topic around human trafficking, and we bring in experts from the field to talk about that topic, and participants can have that direct interaction and problem solving and peer learning through that sort of virtual space. We are just starting to put together regional gatherings in sort of a model of bringing folks together from a certain region to focus on their needs in that region around human trafficking. And well, you'll learn more. This is a pilot project that we're just starting and are really excited about. We have an extensive resource library. We do a lot of individual and tailored coaching for tribes, for organizations, sometimes individuals who are interested in getting involved in responding to human trafficking. We do trainings like this, and then we do comprehensive engagements where we work very closely with an organization or a tribe in whatever their needs are, wherever they're at in responding to human trafficking. And again, bring in experts, utilize the expertise that is on our team, and help them with whatever it is that they need support with. Next slide, please. So now we will sort of dive into human trafficking in Indian country. And one thing that Mitzi and I always like to say is we could talk about this for a month. We could go into, this is really just the beginning of the conversation and the beginning of talking about how to respond to trafficking in Indian country, what things are important to be thinking about, how important partnerships and multidisciplinary responses are. All of these pieces we could talk about forever. So just keep that in mind. This is not sort of a one and done. You can check the box that you've had a training on human trafficking in Indian country, but an ongoing educational journey. Excuse me, next slide, please. So there's a project called Reclaiming Native Truth. It's incredible. You'll have the link to it. You can Google it. And this project put together a sort of best practice framework for how to talk about and address issues in Indian country. And so Mitzi and I have sort of adopted this framework for this presentation because we think it really just encapsulates so much of what we are trying to communicate with you, and it's an easy thing to sort of think about and remember as you are thinking about creating relationships with tribes in your area and Native serving organizations, and how to think about addressing human trafficking specifically in Indian country. And those are these four sort of key themes in the framework, is talking about visibility of Native people and tribal people in human trafficking, in your communities, in everything that we do. talking about the value coming from a strength-based place of the value that Native and tribal folks bring to our communities, and all of the issues that you might be dealing with and thinking about, addressing that from a strength-based place, remembering, educating yourself, and honoring the history of tribal people on this land, and understanding the generational trauma that comes with that, and how that is not a past occurrence, but it is an ongoing, breathing, living reality for Native communities. And then a call to action. So all of this, educating yourself, learning, approaching the work with an open heart and an open mind, and then what. And so as we're talking today, we're going to go through all of these different themes in the framework as sort of a model for best practice in addressing issues in Indian country. And then, so I am not Native, and it is my honor to work with folks in Indian country and work on addressing human trafficking in Indian country. And I think as a non-Native person, it's really important to think about how you are being an ally to our communities. And there's another resource, excellent resource called the Indigenous Ally Toolkit. And it talks about different ways to approach being an ally, or working with Indian country, working with folks that might be outside of your culture and your community and perhaps your comfort zone. And I'll just read this quote because I think it's wonderful. Being involved in any kind of anti-oppression work is about recognizing that every person has a basic right to human dignity, respect, and equal access to resources. And as you all know, doing anti-human trafficking work is doing anti-oppression work, and those two things cannot be separated. And especially when we're talking about what human trafficking looks like in Indian country, those two things they go hand in hand. And as you, continue your education and training about human trafficking, you also have to, in order to do that work well, you have to also be really getting involved in educating yourself and learning about how to do that with an anti-oppression lens. Next slide, please.
All right. So building off of the framework that Shira laid for our conversation, it's really important that I just start by acknowledging the strength and resilience of Native communities. And I also want to mention that I and Shira may be kind of using language interchangeably, from American Indian, Native American, Indigenous, tribal, Indian country. And so you may hear us use those terms throughout the presentation. What I will say about that is when you're working with Indian country and in tribal communities, is to be mindful that not everybody recognizes or is accepting of the same term. So I always just encourage people to ask, and also acknowledging that most of the time tribal members they identify as the tribe that they are, instead of saying that they're Native American. So for example, like today when I did my introduction, I said I'm Yuchi and I'm an enrolled member of the Muscogee Nation. Just keeping that in mind as we're going about the presentation and in your work with survivors, that everyone's kind of at a different level of how they identify, and just approaching that with a respectful curiosity in your work with survivors. So I think I just want to start by again acknowledging the strength and resilience of Native people. Like I said, there's Native people, tribal communities all across the United States. And, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. There are students, soldiers, professors, teachers, artists, actresses, actors, lawyers. I mean, every walk of life, Native people, we're present And so that's that visibility piece that I really want to just put out there right at the forefront. And that Native people and tribal communities really are contributing to the overall welfare of, not only their particular nation, but also the nation as a whole, the United States. Tribal communities are invested in the land and in the country. And so I just want to mention that as well. And being Native American may mean something different for each person, and likely does. So it could mean being deeply involved in protecting their teachings and advancing their traditions, or it can be someone who's less connected to their tribal community, but that still maintains, a unique identity in other ways with the larger society. So there's really no one way to be Native American, and every tribe and tribal citizen has their own unique culture and history. And many times, like I said, people identify with their own particular tribe. So that's where we're going to start today, by honoring the strength and resilience of Native people and the common values that we have in our communities. We have connection to land and places. There's a definite importance of relationships and family and community, and the spiritual and ceremonial practices and ways of living that are in line with each community's culture and traditions are those very important values. And those common values to understand that are on this slide, but also keeping in mind, again, that every tribe and each tribal citizen has a unique history, culture, and those traditions that are unique to them. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we are laying the foundation here of trauma and historical trauma. So this is when I'm going to go back and encourage everyone to please take care of yourself as we go through talking about trauma briefly, and then going into more historical trauma and specifically impacting Indian country. So in order to start that and think about how to address the current problem of human trafficking in Indian country, we have to have a basic framework and understanding of trauma. And so when we think about the last 3 years, they've been historic, to say the least, and the word trauma has probably been introduced to, if not every person on the call, most of you all in your professional work, just looking at the lens that you're bringing to this work and that slide that we did on Mentimeter before. So I just want to point out that each of our experiences with, the last 3 years is unique to us and to our family. And keeping that in mind, I want you to just take a minute to think about the word trauma and in your work and what you already know about that word. And just to get everyone thinking and engaged again, I'd like you to use your smartphone to go to mentimeter.com again. You're entering the code at the top of the slide to put in your response, but I want you to just tell me 1 or 2 words that come to mind right off when asked this question, like, what is trauma? And I'll give everyone a moment to put their responses in. Again, I'm just encouraging everybody as you're thinking about this. I know it may bring up different things for everyone, so just taking good care of yourself as you're doing this. Stress, pain, life-changing, feeling hurt, long-lasting, personal, nightmares, debilitating, events that harm, see people in the chat, sadness, abuse, loss, everlasting memory, loss of autonomy, triggers. Wow. Thank you everyone for participation. Mental anguish, what's changes for you, or changes who, I can't see the rest of it in the chat, but changes, I mean, disorganized thought, anxiety, something that has lasting effects, high anxiety, harmful events that cause ongoing damage. Deep mental, physical, and emotional wounding. I'm going to go ahead and take a drink of water now, because a lot of this is heavy. Like, this is heavy, right? Thank you all for participating, and we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. I really appreciate everybody digging deep there and taking time to do that. So, according to SAMHSA, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to definitions of trauma. Some of you all on this call may be too, because I like different definitions depending on what I'm working with. But SAMHSA has described trauma as individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harming or threatening. Lots of things mentioned on Mentimeter about that. Having those lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning. And people were mentioning in the Mentimeter also the ways that that can happen. So we've all probably read a number of similar definitions to define trauma. And I think one of the important things to remember is that no two people experience trauma the same way. There's many factors that influence the way a person responds to a traumatic event. And this includes like age and like family dynamics, support systems, so many different things that really influence the way each person may experience trauma. And it really is unique to that person. So we can go to the next slide. So just a little bit more, digging in a little deeper to what everyone's kind of already thinking, which is how it impacts an individual, that our mental health. So when an individual or when we experience trauma, our thoughts can be all mixed up. It's hard for us to focus. We may not make logical sense or even make like a simple plan. It can impact our physical body. We can become tense. You know, even now thinking about it, we may be getting tense. We may feel tension in our shoulders or like a tightness in our chest, or maybe, you know, we feel clammy just thinking about these things. And so it really can, you know, take a toll on our body and even create vulnerability to, you know, sickness. And then emotionally, we may have those negative emotions. We might get nervous or scared, lonely, sad, mad, you know, a variety of different ways that it shows up emotionally. And then it also, you know, trauma impacts our social life sometimes. You know, when you think about that mental, physical, and emotional stress after experiencing a trauma, that can impact a person's ability to, you know, want to hang out with their family and friends. So lots of different ways. And then also our spiritual well-being. Some people may stop connecting with their spirituality or their ceremonies, or they may turn away, you know, from that altogether, you know, or it may just be less. Maybe they're not tapping into their spiritual practices as much. So it's really, it's different for everybody, and it may impact, you know, trauma can impact people in different ways. Maybe it's more physical for some people and less, you know, social. So it really is unique to that person. We can go to the next one. And so the impact of trauma really goes way beyond the individual. We again, over the past 3 years, I think as a nation, we have seen that some families have faced extreme hardships and others maybe not as much. And the same goes for communities, and thinking more broadly to nations and internationally. The point is that trauma is far-reaching. And as we think about supporting Native communities and Native survivors of human trafficking, we have to understand the big picture and adjust our lens to think critically about not only the recent trauma that a survivor is presenting with in the present moment when you're working with them, but also that history of trauma in that person's family and community. So what is historical trauma? So I'm going to put you to work again. We're going to use Mentimeter again, or you can use the chat. And I'd like for you all to kind of do the same thing of what words come to mind when you think of historical trauma. I'll give a few minutes for us to do that. So what are a couple of words that come to mind when you think of historical trauma? Genocide. Oppression. Slavery, repeating. Reliving events. Racism, Trail of Tears. Multi-generational, Andrew Jackson. Sorrow for ancestors. Patterns. Lots of stuff coming in. Thank you all for all the participation. World wars. That carries forward. Long-term impacts of war, ongoing. Passed on through oral history. Cultural, racial, ethnic, healed or unhealed. Really powerful stuff, I feel like, coming out here. Thank you all for participating. Generations. All right, thank you all. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So there's some definitions here, but before I get to that, the experiences that were mentioned in the Mentimeter, those are shared by communities and can really result in more cumulative emotional and psychological wounds that carry across generations. And really, this concept of historical trauma, or even the term historical trauma, was coined by a Native American social worker and mental health expert. Her name is Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she coined this term in the 1980s. And I want to give you Braveheart's definition, and then I'm going to go, you all can look at the slide on Sam's definition too, just to add to it. But her definition states that historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma. And so another way to kind of state that or understand that is what's on the slide, that historical trauma is a form of trauma that impacts entire communities. It refers to the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding as a result of group experiences that is transmitted across generations within a community. So that's really what we're going to talk a little bit about as we move forward. And I just have to say that as we do this, I really want to just point out that what we're talking about today is like a drop in the bucket to the history. And so I have to say that, and as I go through also, that I encourage everyone to do your own research. So I'm going to touch on like a few things today as far as historical trauma. And I encourage you all to look further. We're going to share some resources at the end of the presentation that will help you to do that. But this is really just like kind of like an overview, I feel like, for your learning as you're going to dig deeper into this topic. So I'm going to encourage that as I go along as we talk more about historical trauma. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to do my best to link the experiences of colonization, historical trauma, loss, and grief to the current disparities, and specifically why this is important when we're working with Native communities and survivors of human trafficking. And so again, I'm just going to mention that this is just a drop in the bucket of the history of Native people. And there's so much more rich and positive history too, but because we're talking about historical trauma, we're having to lay that foundation here in understanding the current disparities for survivors that we're working with today. So there's a term that is mentioned in one of the resources that is shared at the end of the PowerPoint today, in being an ally. And this term is really, they're in that resource, they're giving some history. So again, I'm going to encourage people to go to these resources. The term of age of discovery, which we may all have learned in our high school history class, and maybe even our children are still learning that term. And the age of discovery says that when Europeans first came to America, that they were learning that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And so we grew up hearing that story, which is really a misconception that has perpetuated false knowledge and created an image of Western superiority. And that concept of discovery really is like saying that the land was empty prior to their arrival, and that the Indigenous or Native people who already lived on the land, that they were somehow less than the explorers that came. And at its heart, that's really racism. And so we have to, when we look at the age of discovery, we have to, some of us may have to really relearn what we were taught, because when the Europeans first came over to occupy America, most of them didn't even consider the people that they encountered. They looked at them like they didn't have their own cultural or religious traditions, and that they had no culture or religion at all. And so we have to kind of relearn that piece, that age of discovery piece, and around Columbus, and really try to educate ourselves. And so again, I'm just going to continue to, as I go through this, to encourage continued learning after today. And then there's also the term manifest destiny. And so manifest destiny was the idea that the United States was destined by God, and its advocates believed at that time, which was 1845, that they were going to basically expand and spread democracy and capitalism across the North American continent. And this really drove that 19th century territory expansion by the United States, and was used to justify the forced removal of Native Americans and other groups from their communities, from their ancestral homes. And so we really have to rethink that, because we may have been taught it in a different way. And another important term that I hope that you all will jot down and research further is the Dawes Act. And so the Dawes Act was just one of many official processes that were put into place that, I will say in quotes, literally what they wrote was to kill the Indian and save the man. And in 1887, Congress passed the General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act. And this was devastating. I'm giving you an overview of these different pieces of history. And so one more term that I want to mention, again, for further reading and research, and there's more and more, I think, attention now to the boarding school era, what they call the boarding school era. So, you know, for 100 years, going back to the mid to late 1800s, Native American boarding schools existed in the United States. And the schools were funded by the government and meant to, you know, basically sever American Indian culture and civilize the Indian. And so when we think we're thinking about historical trauma and all those pieces that we saw in Mentimeter and all the things about trauma, I just want everybody to keep that in your mind as we're thinking about the impact of these different events on Native communities and tribal nations. So hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families, and they were placed in boarding schools that were operated by the government and churches. And these Native children who were removed from their homes, their families and communities, they were taken to schools sometimes that were really far away, and they were punished for speaking their native language. They were banned for acting in any way that might be seen as a representation of their community, their culture, their traditions, and stripped of their traditional clothing. They cut their hair a lot of times. They took their personal belongings. And now, you know, people are starting to feel safe enough to come out and talk about that they suffered physical abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse and neglect, and they experienced treatment, you know, that really constituted torture for speaking their language. And so just in thinking about this for myself, you know, it brings up a lot of negative emotions for me, even in talking about it. And so I encourage you all that, you know, as you're doing your research, take good care of yourself, but also as you're working with Native communities and survivors, it's really important to understand that history and how, even though it was, you know, between the 1860s and the 1960s, that really doesn't feel that long ago to me, because, you know, my great grandmother went to boarding school. So it still brings up feelings today. And so just being mindful of that when you're working with Native survivors and tribal communities, that it really does still, it's alive, that those triggers still come up, even though it wasn't my trauma. That's where the intergenerational piece comes in. So it's linking this across generations into the present day. And we go back to Braveheart's definition of historical trauma, that it's cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan, across generations, and stemming from that massive group trauma. And so this was really, you know, a loss of land, a loss of people, culture, and really that systematic transmission of trauma over generations is really what has occurred. And traumatic events that were suffered during previous generations, like for example, my great-grandmother, they can often create a pathway that can result in current generations, like myself, being at an increased risk of experiencing a variety of different problems, whether that's mental or physical distress, or really, it can also, a lot of times with this situation, it left Native people unable to, draw strength from their communities and their culture, or even utilize their natural family and tribal support systems because of that disconnect that happened. And so how does that play out now with survivors of human trafficking or people who are experiencing trauma like human trafficking today? Is, that we do have large numbers of people in our tribal communities that continue to suffer today from psychological, economic, social, a lot of, physical ailments, a number of different ills or environmental challenges. So it really is learning about historical trauma, and that, I hope, is going to provide a framework for our work with human trafficking survivors now, because those, a lot of the colonization practices are continuing today. And we can go to the next slide. So I just want to kind of emphasize again, when we're working, when we're thinking about historical trauma and survivors today, that this isn't, I heard the term ahistorical and had to look it up because I was like, well, what does that mean? Then when I looked it up, I was like, oh my gosh, I resonate with that. It's not in the past to people who have historical trauma in their family and in their community. When you talk about something that happened to someone's mother, when we talk about something that happened to someone's sister or auntie or grandfather, it doesn't seem like it was in a history book. It seems very real and present today. So that's what we have to come with that lens when we're working with survivors, and especially in tribal communities, and just keeping that in mind, and that loss is experienced collectively. Like, it affects the whole community, when things like this happen, and the culture and context does matter. So working with one particular community, tribal community, that community's culture and their history is totally different in a lot of ways than another, tribe who's just maybe 30 miles down the road. So it's really important to understand that, even because there's a lot of tribes here in Oklahoma, but we're all unique. We all have our own ways of practicing things, cultural practices, ceremonial practices, languages. And so understanding that culture and context does matter, and coming with a respectful curiosity when we're working with Native communities and survivors. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about risk factors and vulnerabilities, and Shira and I are going to talk about this together. So I'm going to take a drink of water and pause for a second,
Yes,
and we'll hop back with you in just a sec.
Thank you, Mitzi, for sharing all of that. And even every time I hear you speak and talk and teach about everything that you mentioned, I'm writing down notes because I'm learning new things and thinking about things in a new way. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And as Mitzi mentioned, sorry, I'm just like still processing. That's a lot.
I know, it's like we need to take a pause, huh?
Yeah. So thinking about how all of those, how that historical trauma, how all of those pieces of generational harm and what that can look like today in the communities that we're working with and with the survivors that we're working with. And I think oftentimes when we're talking about human trafficking and we're talking about, you know, why does it happen? Where does it come from? Some people call it risk factors. Some people call it vulnerabilities. You know, the list can look pretty similar to a lot of different communities. And then there are very specific vulnerabilities and things that we need to be connecting with and understanding around Native survivors of trafficking. And that, you know, so we have poverty, we have homelessness, substance abuse. I'm not trying to go through these quickly because they're not important. They're all very, very important. And as we have mentioned a number of times, this is just the tip of the iceberg on really diving in. But so many of you who are joining us today work with survivors. And so a lot of this list looks very familiar, and you might know more about how poverty and homelessness and substance abuse, sexual abuse can intersect with human trafficking and be a risk factor or vulnerability. One of the things that I was thinking about as Mitzi was talking, you know, how all of that historical trauma can look today is the word distrust just like kept coming into my mind. And you know, if you are thinking about survivors' culture and history and how deep the distrust for systems, for faith communities, for all of these different pieces that can be there to help and still sometimes today are also causing harm. You know, it not only can sort of perpetuate that trauma, but really isolate survivors if you're not understanding those pieces and how all of this really plays into a survivor of trafficking's experience with healing, with you know, interacting with programs like many of you work in or run. And so that's something that I was just sitting with is how scary that must be, and how isolating that must be to sort of look around at what your options are, what the resources are, and not feel trust for any of them can just add to that trauma and isolation. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Mitzi.
Yeah, I think I'll just add something that I learned from another one of our colleagues who we've worked with, who talked about risk factors and vulnerabilities, is that we also want to be careful that it doesn't sound like, you know, victim blaming or like, you know, or that everyone's going to have the same, you know, vulnerabilities or, you know, that this looks the same, because it doesn't. And you all who are working with survivors of human trafficking, you know that they don't have to have maybe any of those things. And so I think that that's really important to point out too. I think these are risk factors and vulnerabilities, but those are also going to be, as you all know, unique to that individual and even the community and systems, like you mentioned, Shira. I mean, their systems may be looking and working excellent in certain communities, and all the partners are working together, and you know, everyone's really trauma informed and understands historical trauma, and everyone gets it, and it's great. And then there may be other systems, like Shira said, where that is not the case, and there's harm being done, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And so we have to be mindful of that in our work with survivors who are coming forward for services, and how they may have that distrust of those systems, and specifically for Native survivors who have had a history of, you know, system impact in their family that has not, that has caused generations of harm.
Yeah. And one more thing I just want to point out in this list is we list jurisdiction as a vulnerability. And I think it's important to remember, as we're talking about Native survivors, that tribes are sovereign nations, and what that means now. You know, we could go into the history of all of the broken treaties and all of the ways that sovereignty has been diminished and taken away by our federal systems. But one of the ways that it has complicates things is the jurisdiction. Who has the power to hold perpetrators accountable, and who has the jurisdiction to respond to human trafficking and respond to traffickers. And so that is not something we're going to go into great detail, because we'd be here for a week. But I would really encourage you to look into that. And, you know, we're going to talk in a minute briefly about the missing and murdered Indigenous people, that topic and the intersection. And I think, you know, we'll be able to talk more about that, you know, hopefully down the road with you all. But it is a critical piece of this very complicated puzzle. And so I encourage you to think about that, think about what that can look like, and to look into that a little bit and pay attention to that, because it's not as easy as just calling, you know, if somebody is being hurt, it's not as easy as just calling 911 and getting a response. You want to start us off here, Mitzi?
Sure. So when we think about everybody, well, I won't say everybody, most of us probably have learned at some point, just again, I'm going back to the lens that people are coming through, whether it's healthcare, law enforcement, victim services, case management. We've all probably, if we're working with survivors, we've probably learned about a trauma-informed approach. And so when we think about this really in working with tribal communities, tribal nations, and, you know, Native survivors, really coming from a place of respectful curiosity is how, I mean, that's just like I think the best way to be empathetic, to be flexible, to and really it's not really just with Native communities, it's like with survivors, you know, like we aren't the experts in their experience, like we aren't the expert in their life. And so really taking that trauma-informed approach and letting them kind of help us learn, because that's what we're there to do, is learn from them on how we can help them. And so, you know, really coming from acknowledging that, you know, strength-based approach too, I think, and acknowledging a community's strength, and incorporating, it says, you know, on the slide, incorporate a deep understanding of the worldview and values of survivors. Like we should be doing that. You know, we really should be trying to be empathetic, see it from their point of view, because if we don't, then how are we really helping them if we aren't trying to use that empathetic lens, and really providing, you know, I feel like most of the people on here that are working with survivors, you understand what most of this is. But I do think that the piece that I want to point out the most is really just committing yourself to, it says the culturally specific work as an organization. And I think that just starts with learning, like you're doing today, and not assuming, I think, not assuming, and just asking. You know, like I started at the beginning of when I was talking about historical trauma, don't assume someone identifies as one way or another. We just ask. I feel like it's better to ask than to assume and offend someone. So really committing ourselves to being sensitive, to being respectfully curious and flexible as we're working with survivors. Go to the next one. then I got into my next slide. So here we are. A few pieces though on here of some considerations is, I think, you know, some things that I've seen in my work before coming to the center and working for my tribal community is, you know, well-intentioned people who really are trying, but maybe doing more stereotypical things. And so really trying to get away from those things and like connecting with the community that you're working with. So, or connecting with that survivor and asking that person, like, you know, if they do identify, you know, if they, you know, in your intake, if you're asking them about their race, or they've listed their race, and, you know, just again, that respectful curiosity of asking, you know, hey, you know, what tribe are you? Or asking, you know, and then letting them kind of lead that conversation, because you never know what they're going to say. But not assuming that because they put something down that, you know, they participate in a lot of cultural activities, because they may or they may not. And that really goes back to that unique piece for each person, each community. I do think, you know, I mean, we all kind of have learned about like creating that welcoming and safe space for people, and offering, you know, something to drink if they're coming in, offering them a snack, and, you know, really just thinking when we're working with survivors, clearly, you know, we may only have one interaction with that person, or we may see them a lot. So we have to really think about how we approach that historical and collective like trauma lens with that person, because that's going to look different for everybody, I think. And then the healing practices and spiritual practices, I would say, especially like when it comes to ceremony, that's unique and sacred to each community. And so doing that, you know, having those conversations in a very delicate way, and coming to the survivor and like talking to them about maybe, you know, tell me about your, you know, if you feel like it's helpful, or if maybe they've brought it up, then asking them to just tell me more about that. Like you know, be a curious learner of what they have to share. And then if they're saying, you know, yeah, like I really, you know, I missed out on our ceremonial grounds, or I didn't get to go, you know, to something, or I really wish I could go back, or I wish I could connect, then that's when it's a good time to you know, to ask like, okay, well, tell me more about that. How could I help with that? You know, is there anything I could do to support you in connecting to some of those things, or some of those people, or some of those practices, and really taking it that way, as opposed to being the expert and saying, oh, here's a list of resources that may not resonate with them. So really letting them lead the way, and not making assumptions. All right.
So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about this framework with these 4 themes that we wanted to make sure to incorporate into our talk today. And the final is this call to action. And as we were putting this presentation together, Mitzi and I both realized, or sort of concluded together, that this whole thing is a call to action, right? Supporting survivors of human trafficking requires all of these things: cultural humility, trauma-informed practice, and community partnerships. And being mindful of time, I will talk a little bit about community partnerships, and then leave a few minutes for questions. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here's sort of a list of things to think about, as well as everything else that we've talked about today, incorporating all of these pieces. But here's sort of a cheat sheet, right? do your homework and ask for help. So as we've been saying, look into these things. This is not, this should not be your one-stop, one and done training on human trafficking in Indian country. And ask questions, be curious. That's always appropriate. Hire American Indians, Native folks in your organizations. Fund Native organizations. If you have funding, if you have tribes or Native serving programs in your communities, send them funding announcements. Don't just try to write the funding announcement for your own organization when you have a partner in your community that is working with Native survivors. Play a supportive role in that way. Help build each other up. You know, what's more important in a partnership, right? Understand sovereignty, understand that you are working with a sovereign nation when you are working with a tribe, and approach it with that respect and that understanding. Make Native people visible, as we talked about earlier. It is not just about all of the negatives that communities might be facing, but all of the incredible additions and all of the things that Native folks and tribes bring to all of our lives and culture, and making sure that we're all paying attention to that as well. And advocate for accurate Native history, and seek a variety of Native voices. As we have said, as Mitzi has said many times, there's not just one Native experience or tribal experience. And so keeping that in mind as well. Next slide, please. And this I'm going to take 2 seconds to talk about this, because we're really hoping to have another one of these times with you all to really dive into missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, also sometimes called missing and murdered Indigenous people or missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW, MMIP. Again, you know, the language we use and the terms we use change and are embraced by different communities. And so as folks that work with human trafficking survivors, keeping in mind that human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual violence, all of these victimizations and these traumas lead to and play a role in missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, and that none of these things exist in a silo or in a vacuum, but they're all connected, and all should be addressed sort of together. And here are a number of fantastic resources as we promised. I'm so sorry we had to race through the last few slides, but didn't want to finish without giving some space and time for questions or comments or anything that you would like to share. Here's our contact information. Any last thoughts, Mitzi?
Just thank everyone for being here and happy to answer any questions. Really appreciate everyone using Mentimeter. I feel like this is the most participatory, get that word out, group that I've seen. So really, really appreciate everyone and the group today. Just thank you all so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Go ahead. Sorry, Shira, go.
No, I was just saying thank you. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That was so rich. I wish we would have 2 hours at least to go through all this. Someone is asking to put the contact slide back in the or put emails in chat. And
sure, I'll put the emails in chat right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and just again to reiterate that we will have this PowerPoint and the actual recording of this program available soon on the STAC website, on that link I put up. And also I want to pick up and just kind of get everyone's thoughts on this. As Shira said, we'd love to do a part 2 and really talk a lot about how and learn more about kind of how to, for me as a service provider here locally, we need to figure out how we can build trust, how we can cultivate ongoing relationships with partners in the community, in the state, that are our tribal communities, that are people from, other tribes that are living here. The Seminole tribe of Florida, I mentioned the Muscogee Indian tribe of Florida. There are so many people here that we want to connect with. Maybe we can start there. I don't see any questions yet. What do you think? Some of our we're educating ourselves, making sure that our brains, our eyes can see, with new stuff in our brains and all that, whatever I said, much less elegantly just now. But what else can we start to do? What do you think? Oh, I think you're still muted, Mitzi.
Am I?
There you are. Okay.
Okay.
I know it's like a gremlin does that.
I definitely, I'm seeing lots of things in the comments about a part 2. I think the next steps are really sharing the PowerPoint with the group, having everyone look at those resources. And then I feel like those resources are going to be a really good guide for connecting with your communities in your area. And so that's really what I would kind of emphasize is, there's a couple of resources. I'm going to have to pull up the, let me say specifically in the resources, there is the Indigenous Ally Toolkit is a great one. And then also the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, they put together a special collection that both of those I feel like are the best place to start before making any other like huge next steps, like building that foundation like everyone is doing today. But then also I think the next step really is connecting with the tribes in your communities and letting them kind of guide that conversation and ways that letting them help to identify, support that they need or that they want.
That's excellent. And let me just do a call now to everyone who's on today if you would like to reach out to STAC, that you can please do that. We'd love it. And we'd love to start conversations, no matter where you are in the state of Florida. It would also be good to see these kinds of connections build in some of our statewide efforts, and would like to know more. So please reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat as well. We would encourage you to join STAC's website and get our newsletters, because we'll be continuing to feature information. Like I was just thinking, Mitzi, you told me about ictnews.org, Indian Country Today, what do you think? Is that a good one? Should I put that one in the chat? This is one too, where, we can just stay mindful, like just be aware, right? And this, I've already started reading, and I really love it. This is by and for Native people, especially, right?
Yep. And I'm noticing in the chat, it looks like Anna Elizabeth is saying to those in the Tallahassee area that she'd be happy to connect her tribal community with other community partners. So I use your resources, and people, to me, that's just an example of how Native communities and tribal nations are typically open, to people who come with the right lens and that respect of sovereignty and wanting to be a support, or at least offer support if they would like it. So.
Okay, that's great. And I put my email in there, Elizabeth. Thank you. And thanks for and moderating that there, Mitzi. And then I'll put the phone number in there so we can also connect. That's great. So hello, can a Native American get a birth certificate from the USA? If yes, is it a long process? I think you might be muted again.
Okay, I'm pulling up the question. Can Native birth certificate? So yes. So Native Americans are United States citizens and should be able to get a birth certificate. So yes. I think that's the right answer to that question. And then I see another question, is the trafficking more initiated from inside the community or outside the community? If it's from the outside, what mechanisms are generally used to separate the victim from their community and family? You know, I don't want to generalize and can only speak from my experience, and I could just say both, you know, and that it's not one or the other. I think there's just not enough research around that right now. As people who work in human trafficking, you know that the research is limited, and often even more so in tribal communities. So I know that doesn't really answer the question, but I also don't want to just generalize and say one or the other.
Very, very good. Okay, any other quotes? Thank you, Elizabeth, for your email. We will be in touch. And okay, so Amy is saying she wants to know more, and more will be coming from us. And also this incredible list of resources will also be coming your way, so you can start doing your own resource. And really, I think that it's great to get this help from you, because there is an awful lot out there. And we want to make sure that the history we read is accurate and is really, the real deal. So thanks
I'll also say, Robin, I put our website in the chat as well. Come and join us. We have a lot of things going on. We have a lot of we have a talking circle next week. We have our community of care. We have all sorts of no-cost services that we would love to see you all there and connect with you individually or as an organization.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This is not the end.
Absolutely. No, this is, and we talked about this when we were doing our prep, this is the beginning for us to be having this forum, but also for us to take this information and to keep growing, as you say, growing capacity and strengthening our networks. That's what the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center is doing. So we're so grateful to you. Thank you, Mitzi. Thank you, Shira. This was, my mind is just everything from the Menti word clouds, and just using that in the future as a good fun thing when you have these webinars and you can't fully interact because there's so many people. Thanks, Kemi, for putting in the information about next week, and that looks great. I've listened to one of your talking circle presentations, and it is so great. So please, everybody, take advantage of that information.